Hello, and welcome to Sunset Zen and Sleepy Stories. Please relax, listen, and enjoy. The Long Green Way, Story 5, The Nantahala, Days 9, 10, and 11. Enter the Nantahala National Forest. There is a quality of light in the Nantahala Gorge that is unlike the light anywhere else Thomas had ever been. He would try later to describe it in the Burgundy Journal, and he would find that description resisted him. Not because the light was indefinable, but because defining it required first dismantling some assumptions about what light was supposed to do, how it was supposed to behave, what the relationship between the sun and the world below was meant to look like. In the Nantahala Gorge, that relationship was different. The gorge was deep, the mountains on either side high and steep and close, and the Nantahala River ran through the bottom of it, cold and green and fast, and the forest on the slopes was dense and old. In the morning, and sometimes in the late afternoon, the sun did not reach the gorge floor at all. It was caught on the rim, up among the high trees, and what came down to the river and the trail along the river was not sunlight, but something refracted and filtered and softened, a secondary brightness that arrived from all directions equally, not casting shadows so much as dissolving them, making the world inside the gorge luminous rather than lit. The Cherokee called the river Nantahala, which Owen had informed them meant land of the noonday sun, because noon was the only time the sun reached the gorge floor, the only hour when the light came straight down between the walls and touched the water directly. The land of the noonday sun, Owen said, the first morning in the gorge, standing at the river's edge and looking up at the slot of sky visible between the ridgelines, which also implies the land of the morning shadow, the land of the afternoon shadow, the brief daily window of actual sun. That's a less romantic reading, Eli said. It's an accurate reading, Owen said. The Cherokee were practical people. They named things for what they were, not what they wished they were. Maybe they named it for the noonday sun because that was the good part, Eli said, not because it was the only part. Owen considered this. That's a more charitable interpretation. I'm a charitable person. You're a strategic person, Owen said, which occasionally resembles charity. Eli smiled without looking at his brother, the smile of someone who has been accurately described and is not going to dignify it with a response. Thomas listened to them and looked at the river, which was running high and cold, and the particular shade of green that very cold, very clear water takes on when it runs over a bed of pale rock, not quite the green of growing things, not quite the green of glass, something between them, something specific to itself, a color that had no name in common use, but which Thomas thought he would remember for the rest of his life. He had been in the gorge for less than an hour, and he already understood that it was going to ask something particular of him, not the climb and view that the ridges asked, not the sustained effort of the ascents, something different. The gorge asked for attention directed inward and downward, rather than up, for the close world, the immediate world, the world of root and rock and river, rather than ridge and sky. It was a different kind of presence. He was finding he had it, or was growing into it. The trail was teaching him, slowly, to be present in whatever mode the landscape acquired. The trail here ran close to the river in places, close enough that he could hear the specific sounds the water made as it moved over different configurations of stone, the way it deepened and hollowed at the base of a boulder, the way it quickened and brightened where the channel narrowed, the way it went briefly still in the pools between the rapids, the surface there almost glassy, reflecting the overhanging hemlocks in a soft, inverted image. He found himself listening to the river, the way he had been learning to listen to the birds, actively, with attention, trying to distinguish one kind of water sound from another, the way a person learns a new language, moving from undifferentiated noise towards something like meaning. He had not known, before this trip, how much the world had to say if you were quiet enough to hear it. He was learning, still learning, every day, the vocabulary of a place that had never needed him to understand it, and which offered its understanding freely anyway, to anyone patient enough to stay. He adjusted his pack and followed his sons north along the river. The Nantahala section of the Appalachian Trail runs for roughly 30 miles through the national forest, following the river for a stretch and then climbing away from it onto the surrounding ridges before descending again. The trail in a recurring conversation with the gorge, approaching and retreating, dropping to the water and rising away. The river always audible, even when invisible, a constant reference point below. The forest here was different from the Georgia forest, older feeling, more enclosed, the understory denser and more varied, the trees larger in their crowns and rougher in their bark. There were hemlocks along the river, large and dark and drooping at their branch tips, with the characteristic gesture of the species, as if perpetually bowing slightly toward the water. Thomas had read, in the weeks of preparation, that the eastern hemlock was under severe pressure across the Appalachians. A tiny invasive insect, called the hemlock woolly adelgid, was moving through the range, killing mature trees, and many of the hemlocks that still stood in the gorge were being treated by volunteers. Small bags of insecticide hung from the lower branches in a last-ditch effort to preserve them. He had not mentioned this to his sons on the trail, not because it wasn't worth knowing, but because he wanted to look at the hemlocks for a few more minutes first, without the weight of their precarity. He looked at them now as he walked beneath them, the long sweeping branches, the tiny flat needles arranged in 2 rows along each twig, like the pages of an open book. The undersides of the needles showing 2 pale stripes that caught the diffuse gorge light. They were beautiful. They were ancient in their form, if not in their specific years. They were in trouble. He thought, everything beautiful is in some kind of trouble. That does not make it less beautiful. He thought, I should tell Owen about the adelgid. He would want to know. He would tell him at lunch. Day 9 moved well. They covered 11 miles through the gorge and along the river, stopping at midday on a flat rock above the water where they ate and rested and watched the kayaker pass below them, a single figure in a yellow boat, working the current through a rapid with practiced efficiency, disappearing around the bend in seconds, there and dawn, in the way of things that belong to the water rather than the land. Thomas watched the kayaker long after the yellow boat had gone, looking at the bend in the river where it had disappeared. There was something he found affecting about a person who moved through a landscape with that kind of competence, not dominating it, not conquering it, but reading it well enough to work with it, to find the line through the current that the river itself was suggesting. The kayaker had not fought the rapid. He had found the rapid's own logic and followed it. He thought this was probably how most things worth doing were done. Not by force, but by attention. The noonday sun found them while they were eating, arrived without announcement, as Owen had predicted it would, dropping straight down through the slot of sky above the gorge and touching the river below them for the first time all day. The effect was immediate and startling. The water, which had been its constant muted green in the diffuse gorge light, went suddenly bright, lit from above rather than around. The surface catching the direct sun and throwing it back in shards and flashes, the ripples in the current turning briefly to something like silver. The three of them stopped eating at the same moment, without any of them saying anything, all of them looking at the river doing its new thing in the new light. It lasted perhaps 20 minutes, the sun moving on its arc, the gorge walls catching it again, the river returning slowly to its regular green. Thomas sat and watched the whole transition, the arrival, the brightness, the slow recession. He did not take a photograph. He thought about taking one and decided against it, which was a decision he had been making more often on the trail. The decision to just look, to let the looking be enough. To trust that the experience of a thing was more valuable than the record of it, even if the record was what lasted. He was not sure he believed that completely, but he was practicing it. Owen watched the kayaker with interest. "I've never kayaked," he said. "Really?" Eli said. "I would have assumed." "Why would you have assumed?" "You seem like someone who kayaks." Owen appeared to consider whether this was an accurate assessment of his personality. "I know a great deal about kayaking," he said, theoretically. "That is extremely on brand," Eli said. "I'm going to learn." Owen said, "In Scotland, there's sea kayaking on the Firth of Forth." He paused, something shifting in his face. Not quite wistfulness, but related to it. The look of someone whose imagined future has just briefly become very real. "I've been thinking about the things I want to do there. The things I want to learn that I haven't had occasion to learn here. Like kayaking," Thomas said. "Like kayaking." And he stopped, looked at the river. "There's a kind of silence that happens when you're on the water, I'm told, even when you're moving. Something about being on the surface rather than in it." He paused. "I want to know that silence." Thomas looked at his son. Owen was 24 years old and going to Scotland and wanted to learn the silence of the water. He was writing in his field journal every day and naming salamanders and standing at every threshold with his arms slightly out from his sides, trying to hold the balance. He was, Thomas looked for the word and found it, earnest. Not naively, not without complexity, but genuinely, deeply earnest about the world and what it contained and what it was possible to know of it. Thomas did not say any of this. He ate his lunch and looked at the river and let his son's earnestness exist in the air without comment, which was, he thought, the right response to earnestness, to let it be there, uncomplicated, unqualified. The Adelgite, he said, instead. Owen looked at it. The hemlock woolly Adelgite. It's moving through the Appalachians, killing mature hemlocks. He looked at the trees above them. Those are being treated. See the small bags on the lower branches? Owen stood immediately and moved to the nearest hemlock and looked. He was quiet for a moment, examining the tree, the bags, the needles. Then he sat back down and wrote in the journal. Several lines, quick and deliberate. How widespread? He said, still writing. Significant. Moving north. Some areas of the southern AT have lost most of their hemlocks in the last 20 years. Owen looked up. He looked at the hemlocks along the gorge with an expression Thomas recognized. The expression of a person who has just seen something familiar in a new light, who has added a dimension of knowledge to a perception and found that the world looks different now, more complicated and more demanding. I didn't know, Owen said. I know, Thomas said. I just thought you'd want to. Owen looked at him for a moment. Something in the look, not quite surprise, not quite gratitude, something between them, something more like recognition. The acknowledgement that his father had held the information for him, had waited for the right moment, and had understood that Owen would want to know. Thank you, Owen said. He wrote another line in the journal. Day 10 was when Eli twisted his ankle. It happened in the way that these things happen on a trail, not dramatically, not with warning, but with the sudden, intimate wrongness of a body part doing something a body part should not do. They were descending a moderately steep section of trail, the surface wet from a brief morning rain, the roots crossing the trail slick and dark. Eli was in front, moving at his usual steady pace, and then there was a sound, not a crack, not a snap, but a brief, sharp intake of breath, and Eli stumbled, caught himself on a trekking pole, and kept walking. Thomas, behind him, saw it happen. He saw the stumble, the catch, the recovery. He saw Eli straighten and continue, without pausing, without looking back, without any alteration in his pace that a person who had not been watching very carefully would have noticed. He noticed. Eli, Eli, he said. I'm fine, Eli said, without turning around. Stop for a second. I'm fine, Dad. I slipped on a root. Thomas stopped walking. He stood on the trail and looked at his son's back, at the way he was moving, at the subtle difference in his left step that was there and then smoothed away as Eli consciously corrected for it. You're favoring the left ankle, Thomas said. A pause. Eli stopped walking. He turned around. He had the look of someone who had been found out in something small and was deciding whether to contest it. He looked at his father. He looked at the trail ahead. He looked at his father again. It's fine, he said. How long? Another pause. Longer. How long have you been favoring it? Thomas asked. Eli's expression shifted, something releasing in it, some held thing loosening. Since the creek crossing, he said, about 2 miles back. 2 miles. Thomas came forward. He crouched in front of his son, his bad me protesting this, and he ignored it, and said, Can I look? Eli sat down on the trailside rock and unlaced his boot, and Thomas looked at the ankle. It was not badly swollen, a mild puffiness on the outer face, tender to careful pressure, Nothing that suggested a serious sprain or anything worse. A roll, probably. A grade 1, maybe the low end of a grade 2. Not an emergency. Not nothing. "Why didn't you say anything?" Thomas said, sitting back. Eli was looking at the ankle. "Because it's fine," he said. "Because I didn't want to slow us down." "Eli." "I know," Eli said. He looked up. "I know. 2 miles on a turned ankle." "It's not 2 miles," Thomas said again, not harshly, just clearly. Eli was quiet. He looked at his boot. He had the expression of someone confronting a habit in themselves that they had thought was virtuous and are beginning to understand is something else. Not virtuous, but a habitual. The habit of self-sufficiency, taken 1 degree past what the situation required. Thomas sat down on the rock beside him. He looked at the ankle. He looked at the trail ahead, which was continuing north through the gorge without particular concern for any of them. He thought about the 2 miles. He thought about Eli walking on a rolled ankle for 2 miles without a word, adjusting his stride, absorbing the discomfort, managing it privately and efficiently in the way he managed most things. He thought about all the times he had watched Eli do some version of this, not with ankles, but with harder things. Things that left no visible mark and had not said anything because Eli seemed fine, because Eli was always fine, because Eli had always presented fine so thoroughly that it took vigilance to see through it, to what was underneath. He had not always been vigilant. He was being vigilant now. "I do it too," Thomas said. Eli looked at him, the not saying, "When something hurts or isn't working or I'm managing something, I'd rather not have to explain." He paused. "I've been doing it for 53 years. I recognize it." He looked at the trail. There were years, the years after the divorce, especially, when I was walking on the equivalent of a rolled ankle every day and telling everyone I was fine, including myself. Particularly myself. He paused again. "It is not a sustainable approach. What would you have done differently?" Eli asked. He asked it with the directness he sometimes deployed when a conversation had arrived somewhere real. Not a challenge, not an accusation, a genuine question, a kind that required something true in return. Thomas thought about it. "I would have said it sooner," he said. "Whatever it was, whatever was wrong." He looked at his son. "The saying doesn't fix the ankle, but someone else knowing about it changes the walking, even a little." Eli was quiet. He looked at the trail ahead. "It's not the same," Eli said. "It's related." Eli considered this. He pressed gently on the outside of his ankle, testing it. "It really is okay," he said. "I'm not hiding something serious. It just twinged." "I know," Thomas said. "I can see that. I'm not worried about the ankle." He paused. "I'm noticing something else." Owen had caught up to them. He had been slightly behind, writing in the journal as he walked, which he could do with the practice of years. The way some people can knit and watch television simultaneously. And he stopped when he saw them sitting and looked at the ankle and said, "Grade 1, maybe low 2, Thomas said. Owen crouched and looked with the unsentimental attention of a scientist examining data. He pressed 2 fingers to the outer malleolus, felt the swelling, and watched Eli's face for a response. "Wrap it," he said. "We have the ACE bandage. Wrap it. Anti-inflammatory if you have any. and take it slow the rest of the day. I have ibuprofen, Eli said. Then take it. Owen stood. And next time, say something sooner. He said it without edge, not a reprimand, not even a suggestion. Just a fact, offered in the tone of someone who names things by what they are, which was Owen's tone for everything. Eli took the ibuprofen. Thomas wrapped the ankle. He had done this before, coached by the same physical therapist who had advised him on the knee. And he did it properly, the figure-8 pattern, firm but not restrictive. Eli laced the boot back up, and they sat for a few minutes, drank water, and looked at the gorge around them. The river was visible through the trees below, the green, cold flash of it, moving fast, unconcerned. 2 ravens passed overhead, high, their calls descending to the gorge floor before the birds themselves were visible. That deep, resonant cronk that had no analog in Thomas's experience, not a caw like a crow's, something older and more deliberate, as if the raven were speaking rather than calling. They circled once over the gorge and then rode a thermal, up and over the eastern ridge, and were gone. Ravens, Owen said, looking up. I know, Eli said. Common raven, not fish crow. The call is Owen, Eli said. Yes. I know. Owen looked at his brother. You do, he said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been proven right about something he cared about. You've been learning. Eli smiled. Not the small, real smile of the particular moments, but a broader one, tired and warm, and directed at his brother. 10 days with you, he said. It's impossible not to. They stood up. They walked north, more slowly, Thomas watching Eli's gait, and Eli accepting the watching without comment, without the deflection of, I'm fine, or the overcompensation of a deliberate normal stride. He walked at the pace the ankle allowed, and the ankle allowed a reasonable pace. And they moved through the gorge together in the green and diffuse light that was not quite sunlight and was not quite shadow, but something between the two. The land of the noonday sun, doing what it did in the morning, holding its light above at the rim, waiting for the hour when it could bring it all the way down. It was the ankle that prompted Owen to say the thing he had not said. They were in camp that evening, Day 10's camp, a flat spot above the river where the sound of the water came up through the trees in a constant, low rush, louder here than it had been downstream. The river narrowing and quickening around a bend below them, and Eli had elevated the ankle on his pack and was reading, and Owen and Thomas were sitting outside on a log in the last of the gorge's diffuse light. And Owen was not writing in the journal, which was unusual enough that Thomas noticed it. He was looking at the river through the trees. He had been looking at it for a while. He had the quality of stillness that Owen had when he was thinking about something that was not an idea, but a feeling. When the usual verbal processing had slowed, when what was happening inside him was not yet language. Thomas sat beside him and did not say anything. After a while, Owen said, I'm scared about Scotland. Thomas looked at him. I don't say that to anyone, Owen said. I haven't said it. I've been saying I'm excited, which is also true. I am excited, but I've been underneath the excitement for months, scared. A pause. Eli knows. I think Eli has known without my saying it, but I haven't said it. What are you scared of? Thomas asked. He asked it the way he tried to ask questions of his students when the question mattered, openly, without the shape of an expected answer already in it, without the implication that whatever they said would be redirected towards something more comfortable. Owen was quiet for a long time. Not the silence of someone refusing to answer, but the silence of someone being honest with themselves about what the answer was, which required more time. Being ordinary there, he said, finally. That's the main thing. He looked at his hands. Here, at home, at undergrad, even in the master's program, I've known what I was good at. I've known the shape of my competence. I know how to be Owen here. He paused. In Edinburgh, in a doctoral program with people from everywhere, people who are the best at their own places, the way I am at mine, I don't know if I'm going to know how to be Owen there. Thomas sat with this. He understood it, not in the specific way his son felt it, not the particular fear of a 24-year-old scientist on the edge of a new world, but in the broader, human shape of it, which he had felt at different points in his own life, and which he suspected everyone who had ever attempted anything real had felt. The fear that the self you had built and knew and relied upon might not be sufficient for the new territory. The fear that competence was local, contingent, dependent on context, and that changing the context might expose something underneath it. Can I tell you something? Thomas said. Owen looked at him. When I started teaching, my first year, 25 years ago, I was terrified every single day. He paused. Not of the students, not really, of being found out, of someone realizing that I didn't know what I was doing, that I was constructing the performance of competence from the outside in, that the confidence I projected in front of 30 teenagers was something I was building on the spot for materials I was not sure were adequate. He looked at the river. Every day, for most of that first year, what changed? Owen asked. A few things. He thought about it. I got better, which helped. The knowledge became more solid. The practice became more habitual. The performance became less performance and more just me doing the thing. He paused. But also, and this is the one I think matters more, I stopped being afraid of being found out. Not because I stopped having things to be found out about, but because I realized that everyone in every room is doing some version of the same thing. Building themselves from the outside in, or the inside out, or some combination. That competence is not a thing you have and then deploy. It's a thing you make every day in the room you're in. Owen was listening. He had the quality he had when he was receiving information he needed. Very still, all of his considerable attention directed at the source. You are going to be ordinary in Edinburgh, Thomas said, for a while. You are going to be in rooms where other people know things you don't know and do things you can't yet do. And you are going to feel like what you actually are, someone at the beginning of a new thing. He looked at his son. And you are going to be fine, Owen. Not immediately, not on the first day or the first month, but you are going to be fine because you are the person who stands at every threshold with your arms slightly out, trying to hold the balance, and then steps through anyway. You have always done that, since you were 5 years old. Owen looked at him. The particular Owen expression, the compressed mouth, the managed satisfaction, was not there. What was there instead was something younger and more exposed, something Thomas had not seen on his face in years, the simple, unguarded face of someone who has been seen. "Since I was 5 years old," he said. "First day of kindergarten." Thomas said, "You walked in without looking back, but I watched your shoulders, and I could see, just before you went through the door, that you steadied them, deliberately, the way a person does when they are scared and going in anyway." Owen was quiet for a long time. "I remember that day," he said finally. "I know, I was terrified." Then he reached for the journal, which was on the log beside him, and opened it and wrote something. He wrote for longer than his usual entries, 3 or 4 minutes, the pen moving steadily, Thomas sitting beside him in the dimming light of the gorge, not looking at the page, looking at the river. When Owen finished writing, he closed the journal. "Did you ever feel," he started. He stopped. He tried again. "When we left, Eli and me, for college, did you feel like you knew how to be yourself after that, without us there?" The question landed in Thomas with the weight of something that had needed to be asked for a long time. He felt it in the chest, in the place where things that mattered lived. He looked at his hands, at the river, at the trees. "No," he said. "Not immediately." Owen nodded, slowly. "I had to find a new shape for it," Thomas said. A new way of being Thomas Calloway, which had been for 20-some years. Primarily, Thomas Calloway, who was your father in the daily sense, who made the lunches and drove to the practices and helped with the homework and was there when nightmares came. And then, that daily shape was gone. He paused, and I had to find out what was underneath it. "What was underneath it?" Owen asked. Thomas thought. He thought honestly, the way the trail had been teaching him to think, without the instinct toward the comfortable answer, toward the answer that resolved things cleanly. "Someone who was afraid of being ordinary too," he said. "Who had built his sense of himself as a father very carefully, over many years, and who was not entirely sure what he was when the scaffolding came down." Owen was looking at him. "The woodworking helped," Thomas said. "The walking. The students who kept arriving and needing things and didn't care about my existential situation." He almost smiled. "Teenagers are good for that. They are so thoroughly in their own stories that they don't have much room for yours, which is, as it turns out, exactly what you need when you are in danger of disappearing into yours." "You seem like yourself," Owen said. "Now, here. I am more myself here than I have been in a while," Thomas said. "That's probably some of what this trip is." Owen nodded. He looked at the journal closed in his lap. He looked at the river. He looked at his father. "I'm glad you're here," he said. It was the same thing Thomas had said on the first night, from his camp chair in the Georgia dark. He recognized the echo of it and thought Owen probably knew it was an echo and had chosen it deliberately, which was the kind of thing Owen did, the precision of word choice, the awareness of what had already been said and what the repetition of it meant. "Me too," Thomas said. The 11th day dawned into a different quality of morning. Still in the gorge, still under the high walls of the mountains. But the air had changed overnight, cooled considerably. carrying the first real hint of what the mountains could become in a different season. A breath of the autumn that was still months away, but already present in potential. The way the future is always present in potential. Waiting quietly in the current moment to be arrived at. Thomas felt it when he stepped out of the tent, a different kind of air in his face. He stood in it for a moment, tilting his face up slightly, breathing it in. It smelled of the river and of the old hemlocks and of something mineral and clean that he associated with cold air over water. It smelled like a beginning, which seemed appropriate for day 11, the halfway point, roughly, of the 22 days. The place in the journey where you have gone far enough that going back seems as long as going forward. Where the only rational option is to continue, which is also the wanted option, which is also the thing you would choose even if it weren't the only option. He made the coffee. He did it quietly, with the deliberateness he had developed over the 10 previous mornings, measuring the grounds into the filter and setting the small kettle to heat, and standing in the cold porch air, listening to the river below, and feeling, oh, with a fullness he had not expected when he planned this trip, enormously, quietly grateful. For the trail, for the gorge and the hemlocks and the river and the noonday sun that had reached the water the previous afternoon and turned it briefly from green, so that they had all three stopped walking and stood at the bank and watched it without needing to say anything about it. For Owen and the field journal and the thing Owen had said the previous evening, "I'm scared about Scotland," which had cost him something to say, and which Thomas would not forget. For Eli and the ankle, and the 2 miles walked on it, without complaint, and the larger thing, the ankle was an instance of, the self-sufficiency taking 1 degree past what the situation required, the not saying, the managing alone, which was Eli's version of the same thing Thomas had always done, the habit running in the family the way certain features ran in families. The cheekbones and the eye color, and the particular way they all three went quiet when they were in pain. He thought, I see it in him because I know it in myself. The knowing of yourself is how you begin to know your children. Or the knowing of your children is how you begin to know yourself. Possibly both directions at once. The knowledge running both ways across the decades, father to son and son to father. The understanding arriving late, but arriving. He thought, it is not too late. None of this is too late. The kettle came to heat, and he made the coffee, and the birds began in the gorge above him, and the river went over its stones below, and the cold morning air moved between the hemlocks with a sound like breathing. And Thomas Calloway, Stillwater, stood in the middle of it and let it be exactly what it was. On day 11, they climbed out of the gorge. The trail rose from the river valley steeply, gaining 1,500 feet in just over 2 miles, switchbacking up through the forest with the kind of sustained commitment that required the full engagement of lungs and legs and will. Thomas climbed behind his sons, watching their backs rise and fall, feeling the familiar rhythm of his own breathing deepen and steady. His knee was quiet. Eli's ankle, wrapped again this morning, was holding. He watched his sons climb. Owen set the pace. Not fast. Never fast. but relentless in the way that Owen was relentless about most things, moving steadily upward with the absorbed expression of someone who was thinking about several things simultaneously and had allocated enough attention to each of them that none was being neglected. His poles planted and his boots found a rock, and he rose and planted and rose again, and Thomas thought, he has been doing this his whole life, not hiking, the climbing of things, the sustained upward movement towards something, since he was old enough to be the person who walked into school first without looking back. Eli was ahead of Owen today, which was unusual. Owen almost always led, but Eli had woken this morning with a purposefulness that had communicated itself in his movements, in the way he broke camp and laced his boots, and consulted the map with an expression Thomas recognized as the face of someone who has decided something in the night, who has reached some private resolution, and is now simply enacting it. The ankle was part of it, Thomas thought. The conversation on the rock was part of it. The way Eli climbed this morning had some quality of answering something, of responding to a question that had been sitting with him since the creek crossing 2 days before. He climbed well. The wrapped ankle held without complaint. The gorge fell away beneath them as they climbed. Thomas could feel it falling, not see it, mostly, through the trees, but feel it in the quality of the air, which changed as they gained elevation, and in the sound of the river, which diminished behind them by degrees, from a rush to a murmur to a presence to a memory, and then was gone, replaced by the high forest sound of wind and birds and their own breathing. Halfway up, at a switchback where the trail briefly flattened, they stopped to drink water. No one spoke for a minute or two. They stood among the trees and breathed, and looked at the way the light came through the canopy here, different already from the gorge light, brighter and more direct, the sun beginning to reach them at an angle as they gained height, the shadows shorter and more definite. Thomas put his hand flat against the bark of a large white oak and felt it, the roughness, the dry warmth of bark that the sun was not able to be removed. A god was not wrong, was not. He had been touching trees on this trip in a way he never had before, pressing his palm to the bark of old things, as if he could receive something through the contact, some transmission of patience or permanence. He was not sure it worked that way. He did it anyway. Near the top of the climb, where the trail emerged briefly onto an open rocky shoulder with a view east into a wide valley, they stopped and turned and looked back. The gorge was below them, not fully visible, the forest too dense for a clear view down to the river, but present in the landscape as a darkening, a shadow in the shape of the valley. The Nantahala doing its work in the deep place it had made for itself over the long, patient years of its running. The mountains on either side of it rose green and full. The sky above the gorge was the deep lake-made blue of high, clear days, unmarked except for a single thin contrail dissolving slowly from east to west, the passage of something very fast and very high, made briefly visible and then unmade. Thomas looked at the gorge for a long time. He thought about the hemlocks. He thought about the algae moving through the range, the small bags of treatment on the lower branches, the volunteers who came out on weekends to hang them. He thought about the things that were worth the effort of preservation, the things that were worth coming back for, the things you did not let go of without a fight. He thought about the river that was down there, invisible now from this height, still running cold and green in its gorge, indifferent to the fact that they had climbed out of it, carrying its cold water north and west toward the Little Tennessee, toward the Tennessee River, toward the Mississippi, toward the Gulf, moving through the world on its own terms, as rivers always had, as rivers would continue to do when no one alive had any memory of the 3 men who had walked along its banks for 3 days in late May and looked at hemlocks and rapped an ankle and said true things to each other in the dimming gorge light. The river would not remember them. The gorge would not remember them. The hemlocks, the ones that survived the Adelgid, the ones the volunteers were fighting to preserve, would stand for another 100 years after the last of them was gone, drooping their long branches toward the water, offering their pale striped needles to the diffuse gorge light, doing what hemlocks do without reference to the humans who had once passed beneath them and been briefly, genuinely glad. He was glad they had come. He was glad they had passed beneath the hemlocks and seen them. Even though the hemlocks would not know it, he would know it. And the knowing felt important, felt like its own kind of preservation, the carrying of something forward in memory when it could not be carried forward in any other way. Owen came to stand beside him. "You're thinking about the hemlocks," Owen said. Thomas looked at him. "How did you know?" "Because I am too." Owen looked down at the dark shadow of the gorge. "I'm going to look up the volunteer program when I get back to camp. The one that treats the trees. They probably need people. Everyone who is trying to keep something alive needs people. Speaking quick, nothing." Owen said, with the simple conviction of someone stating a fact, so obvious it barely required stating, and which was also true of more things than just hemlocks. Thomas looked at his son. He thought, yes, that is exactly right. "Ready?" Eli said at his shoulder. Thomas looked at him. The ankle had held. The gorge was behind them. North Carolina was around them. The trail continued. "Ready," Thomas said. He turned from the gorge and faced north, where the trail went, where the next 11 days waited. Tennessee, and then Virginia, and then the end of this particular beginning. The return to ordinary life made, he hoped, slightly less ordinary by what they had found in these hills. He took a step. He took another. His boots found the trail, and the trail held him, as it always had, as it would continue to do, north, through whatever came next, all the way to the end. The trail climbs out of the Nantahala and into the high country of western North Carolina, where the mountains grow older and broader, and the trail finds its rhythm across long ridge lines that go on for miles without significant descent. The walking meditative and sustained, the sky enormous on both sides. On day 12, they will reach the Smokies, the most visited section of the AT, the mountains that most people mean when they say Appalachian, and Thomas will write the longest entry yet in the Burgundy Journal. And what he writes will surprise him, because it will not be about the mountains at all. That is the next story. For now, it is enough to have come through the gorge, to have heard what Owen said by the river, to have wrapped an ankle and walked north, to have stood at the top of the climb and looked back at the dark shape of the Nantahala in the valley below. Enough, more than enough. Next in the series, Story 6, The Smokies, in which they enter the most famous mountains on the trail. Owen finds something in the field journal he did not know he had written, and Thomas discovers what he is most afraid of losing. If these stories bring you peace, come back whenever you need them. New ones arrive gently. No rush, no noise, just light and words and rest.